I'm going to be talking about the legal implications of pollen drift. And it's important to note that there have been a lot of cases of farmer versus big seed companies, Starlink, and in regards of modified rice. Those were cases where unauthorized and unapproved GM seeds got into the regular supply, and farmers sued, conventional or organic farmers both sued because of the price drop of the implications of these seeds getting into the supply. And in that case, courts are pretty generous, and there have been a lot of settlements. Not many of these have actually gone into a judge deciding, but the companies settle for big amounts of money. But what happens when it's just a farmer versus another farmer? And so we decided to look at GM versus organic conventional. And I'm just going to say organic from now on instead of organic conventional, but keep in mind that this could just be a conventional farmer too who's not planting organic seeds. But all right. So what's the issue? Well, pollen doesn't observe artificial boundary lines and the formalized rules of property law. So it's great that we have those, but pollen, like a wild animal or even livestock, doesn't really care about that. And right now, a single stalk of corn releases on average 25 million grains of pollen. And with nearly 84 million acres of corn planted, that's a lot of pollen. For organic farmers, the risk of cross-pollination can be really costly. Organic certification is a 3-year process. If there's any GM, you risk losing that certification. Plus, anything that's contaminated can't be sold as organic, which of course gets a higher price. So these are big issues. But the issue, legally speaking, is that both of these farmers are using their land legally. So how do we decide who should bear the cost of that burden? How do we coexist? So what's the current federal law? There is none. There was this committee in 2012, and they said, good stewardship, that's what you should do. Good stewardship is talking to your neighbor. There's really no reason a GM farmer would ever agree to pay for this because they don't lose anything, right? So it's not going to work. So they decided that a buffer zone is considered the best practice to prevent contamination. The buffer, they say, should be about 5 acres. That 5 acres for an organic farmer can cost anywhere from $2,000 to $20,000. So who pays for the buffer? Right now, it's the organic farmer. We disagreed with that, and I'll tell you why. So since we don't have a law, a lot of this ends up in tort law, which is civil law. And right now we're just going to go through a survey of the laws and see why they don't work. So first possible legal solution is nuisance and trespass. They're very similar concepts. What's the difference? Well, a trespass requires an actual physical physical something to fall onto the land. Whereas a nuisance is an interference with the use of enjoyment. So nuisances are usually sound, smells, whereas a trespass is something actually falling onto the land. Pollen drift could be either. So these are just very simplified explanations of what these are, but why don't they work? Well, we have right to farm statutes in almost every state, which say you can't bring a nuisance case against a farmer for farming. So it's not going to work. It could be a really good case, nuisance case, that normally would win. We usually have intent, we usually have harm, and we usually have causation. So that would normally work, but we can't bring that. Trespass also fails. These just aren't really good solutions. So then we also have negligence and strict liability. It's important to note that negligence isn't really a separate idea. It can be its own case, but normally what we're bringing is negligent nuisance. You say the farmer was negligent and that caused the nuisance, rather than just bringing this on its own. Negligence is the failure to take care to avoid foreseeable accidents. Does this really apply? If a farmer is planting legal GM seeds, are they negligent that the pollen drifts? That's not something you can really avoid. So courts have been less than eager to say that that's negligence. It's easily comparable to when a non-approved seed gets into the supply. You can clearly see that that's negligent behavior. But for something going wrong, that seed wouldn't have gotten into the supply. So then we have strict liability, which kind of finishes out our torts. For that, we say intent doesn't matter. If you do the activity, then you are liable. However, that's reserved for the most heinous and undesirable actions. It's really like a last resort. If you do this, you will be guilty because society doesn't like that. We save that for ultra hazardous, chemical spills, things that can really harm people. But would that apply for a GM seed that's legal to plant? No. So the point of this is to say that's not going to work. There was a case of first impression in Western Australia last year. We were all hoping it would go differently than it did. We were writing this paper at the time and watching it eagerly. And unfortunately, what happened was an organic farmer brought this case for negligent nuisance and said that because of the GM farmer planting next door, he couldn't sell his seeds or his produce as organic, and he lost organic certification for a portion of his acres. The judge said there was no physical injury. You could still sell that, you just can't sell it as organic. So he also said it was without precedent, which is true. This was one of the first cases, but we have to start somewhere. And he said there's no basis in principle to show that the law should extend to these events. So kind of discouraging. All the economic loss was put onto the organic farmer, meaning organic farmer, you have to pay for the buffer zone. We don't like that. So we have proposed new regulations. As I said earlier, the pollen is a lot like an animal. And we have, pretty much every state has a statute on fence law for these scenarios. We can either have fence in, and that's where the person with the livestock fences in their livestock on their land, and they pay for that fence to prevent liability from their animals going out onto other land. In that scenario, if we adopt that, then the GM farmer pays. A fence out is where the landowner who doesn't have livestock has to fence their land so that they keep out livestock. And so in our scenario, that would be the organic farmer. Fence out is really only popular in the West where they have open grazing. When open grazing is the law, you have to fence your land in. Otherwise, you expect animals to come on it. And then some more states that have, these are the more modern rules, are cost shares, where you can either have a mandatory cost share if you don't have animals, even if you don't have livestock, you're paying 50%. Illinois has that law. Most people don't like it. But then we have equal cost shares, which look at the actual, what the land's doing. And if you're the only person with livestock, then you're going to pay to fence them in. If the other person gets livestock in the future, then they'll pay you their portion. So when we apply this to pollen drift, obviously our preference would be for GM farmers to fence in, but I think a more realistic option is a cost share. But if we don't choose a cost share model, how do we decide who should pay? And that's where economics kind of comes in. And we went with least cost avoider. We said that if whoever it would cost less to pay for that buffer zone should be the one who's paying it, because that will maximize social welfare generally. And we actually looked at research to show who it would cost more. And normally when we're looking at organic versus GM, we look at yield per acre. But we decided that wasn't really the best way to decide this, because we know that people are more willing to pay higher amounts for organic food because society values this. And so we looked at profits per acre. And what came out was that it really costs the organic farmer substantially more money to plant buffer as non-organic and sacrifice that land versus a GM farmer to plant some other crop there. So our decision was a fence-in model.